Here we go. Looks like we've got a number of familiar names. I don't have any faces, of course, but welcome everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Give a little time for everyone to join here. Perfect. Perfect. Excellent. All right. Okay. No, let's begin. I suppose. I mean, we've got a ton of content, people, to cover here. So thanks for taking the time to join us, presumably after work, uh, to have a great discussion with myself. My name's Jason Yim. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus, and you know, this of course is Walt Sutherland, the illustrious Walt Sutherland, who manages the Vancouver branch for Sinclair Dental, and we've got some fantastic content for you all. So of course, the subject is managing growth. Should I relocate my practice or renegotiate my lease? This is going to be a huge topic, especially with some of the changes and direction of Canadian real estate uh, now, but also in the near future. I'm going to launch a poll for everyone here. Appreciative, see where's everyone at as far as their particular real estate situation. So again, the purpose of today's webinar is going to be discussing, well, first of all, protecting profit. Is it the right time to purchase a piece of real estate, a unit, or perhaps leasing your real estate? If you're already leasing a space, it's the best thing to stay in your particular space right now. Or if, let's say, for example, you are an associate and you're thinking to start on your own entrepreneurial journey, where do you start? Do you start with buying your own piece of land or building, or would you rather lease out a space for someone else? Or heck, for those that already own a practice and perhaps you're looking for a second location, would it be better now to buy a building or perhaps lease a second space? We'll also touch on how do you decide what's the right space for you if you're looking for a space. Do you decide on 1,200 square feet, 2,000 square feet, 3,000 square feet? What's the right fit for you? We'll also touch on, should you expand or renovate or relocate? What are some of the metrics there to decide what's the right move for you and when is the right time to buy a space or lease a space? We'll also touch on some of the key points of negotiation in a lease to help protect the profits and proceeds of your eventual exit, in addition to touching on some of the expenses that you might face if you decide to relocate your clinic. We'll keep the Q&A open as well. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type it in. I'd like to, of course, I've already introduced Walt, but Walt, if you could perhaps touch on your long career for the audience to give them a sense of who you are and your experience here.
Okay, thanks, John. And everyone, I'm very pleased and happy to join you tonight. As John mentioned earlier, I'm the BC branch manager for Sinclair Dental. I've been in dental over 30 years. A lot of my experience has been in the digital imaging side of the business, managing different digital manufacturing companies. I'm also the co-founder of a imaging center in Vancouver, two of them called Orbit Imaging, where we provided OMS imaging for the teeth, face, and jaws way back in the early 2000s, where before it was really a trend for the most part. And and I've been now with Sinclair about a year, coming up on a year and a half, and enjoying my time with them. So thank you.
Well, we're very happy to have you and fortunate to have you here. Thank you. A little bit about myself. So, I've been with Cirrus for a number of years now, and I'm one of the senior consultants. My primary focus is, well, frankly, it's an education piece for both the doctors, but also even for the lenders we potentially work with. The key thing is in terms of the information that's out there right now, we do find that, uh, frankly, there's a distinct lack of correct information for both doctors and landlords. What we found is throughout our 31 years now, in terms of who represents the doctor when it comes to their real estate needs, there's been a bit of a void here. So to give you a sense of how we fit into this, typically, if you're looking to lease a space, or even if you're looking to buy a building, there's going to be two players in the mix. Certainly, the real estate broker has always played a role in this. Um, what they do, of course, is their expertise is in finding the space. They're going to have an excellent eye and their ears on the ground when it comes to understanding what's coming up as far as for lease, what's coming up for sale, and also some of the demographics and rent details of the area that you're looking at. What we found though in our 31 years is, well, the problem is the way they get paid. The typical process in terms of that remuneration by to the broker, but is by the landlord. So the moment you sign a lease, for example, if the lease is for 10 years and the amount of rent you'd be paying over that 10 years base rent is, for example, $1 million, the broker is extremely likely to get a paycheck of $30,000 to $60,000 the moment you sign them. So we've always found that to be a conflict of interest. How are we going to represent your best needs in the space, potentially getting reductions in rent, free rent period, additional fixturing period when you want to build out? How are we ever going to get that if we're being paid simultaneously by the landlord? The flip side of this is, of course, a real estate lawyer or other lawyers that may have some experience in looking at the lease, and certainly they have their uses here. Uh, we don't do any wills and estate planning. We don't set up your corporations. We leave that to the lawyers. But when it comes to negotiating the lease, we find sometimes there's a distinct lack of information that anybody negotiating the lease will need, and that is the real estate data. So where Cirrus fits in is right in the sweet spot. We're right in between the broker and the lawyer. We have the real estate data, which I'll give you a show of in a few moments. So we can draw upon those demographics to give you a sense of what your market will look like given a certain property. And we also give you a sense of your potential market size should you decide to relocate the practice. Additionally, when it comes to fair rent, how do you know right now what you're paying is fair and comparable to the rest of the market? We can help pull that data using our proprietary software to give you a sense of what your neighbors are paying right now, but even historical trends, what others have paid in the past, in your own building potentially as well. And throughout our 30 years, we've done over 13,000 lease negotiations. Many of them, of course, have been in the Greater Vancouver area. As a Canadian company, we have a significant presence there, in addition to other markets like Calgary, Edmonton, and of course Toronto, where we're currently based. But in addition to that, we've got 20,000 leases to pull from. We've got 20,000 leases in terms of intellectual property that we can draw upon, in terms of precedent set from other negotiations that we have done in the past. And frankly, as clients, we treat this project like it was our own. If we're looking for a new space, we want to make sure that whatever decision you decide to do, whether it's lease a particular space, or if you do decide to buy it, or potentially expand where you're at right now and renovate, We want to make sure that you've got all the information and you're making the best decision for you. So touching on quickly here, why is the lease so important? Well, one of the big items here is, oh, there we go. One of the big items here is, when it comes to that expansion piece and renovation piece, did you make alterations to your space? The lease will determine, one, are you allowed to make alterations to your space? Two, do you need to ask permission from the landlord regarding that? Three, those alterations that you made in the space, do they belong to you or do they belong to the landlord? And four, those alterations, although you've added them in, if you decide to leave, what are the implications of leaving regarding those alterations? These are all huge factors that can affect your decision to potentially relocate your space. And additionally, of course, your office space is going to be the foundation of your clinic. It's going to be the keys to your clinic. It really should be the foundation from which upon you build your wealth for the next 5, 10 years, 15 years. But in addition to that, whatever lease you're signing, whatever location you're at, it can make your practice a lot more sellable in the next 15, 20 years when you do decide to transition out. Or it can play an extremely detrimental role in your eventual transition. Also, in terms of potentially building out, as we'll show you in a moment, the lease obviously has huge potential costs to the clinic. What we typically find is that a healthy clinic will have their tenancy expense be about 8.32% as a national average in relation to their overall production. So this is quite a significant expense, of course. But also in terms of for those that are looking to build out a new space or renovate or looking to potentially expand to the adjacent unit, there's a number of costs associated with building that particular space. Certainly, Walt can touch on that in a few moments, but we want to be able to manage and mitigate as much of those costs as possible through the lease agreement. Also, when it comes to a lease, if you signed a lease that's 5 years in duration, in terms of your term, or 10 years, that's it. You're locked in, right? There's typically no easy way out of that particular space. You need to be abundantly clear that that is the right decision for you before you sign. It's very difficult to move. Landlords know that as well. And what what we like to say is through COVID, we've found out that, frankly, dentists are the best tenants on the planet. Again, it's very difficult for you to move. Not every space is going to be suitable for a dental clinic. It's going to be expensive for you to build out. And all of this is quite time consuming to find the space, to finally build out the space, let alone negotiate the lease. Can be, we found, upwards of a year, depending on the location. It could be even upwards of 2 years. So before you sign anything, it's important to really have that document reviewed to be certain that you're making the right decision. In addition to that, the lease, of course, is going to be extremely important because, like I touched on earlier, it has a significant impact on your ability to sell the clinic. So in addition to your rent playing a significant role in this, we can touch on a couple of items within the lease that have a huge detriment to the value of your clinic at time of sale. But those are, some of the items that are detrimental. What the lease also does is potentially gives you leverage in terms of negotiating, for example, new space. If you're a significant tenant and you're looking to be more significant, you're looking to take on more space and expand into the adjacent unit, this provides you huge amounts of leverage, especially for a landlord that may be potentially hurting in terms of vacancy and otherwise. So in terms of financial impacts, you know, I want you all to not think of the lease simply as a rent payment. It's not just a payment to the landlord, but it is important to identify in terms of what dollar amount is represented here. It's quite significant because although you may be paying, for example, $5,000 a month in rent, and you may be having an increase of 3% a year, this actually has an enormous impact over your career. In fact, it represents $2.923 million in terms of total rent paid in the 30 years that you potentially made it there. So again, the big piece of this is before you decide to sign anything, whether it's a new space or your current space, you need to be absolutely aware and abundantly clear about what you're signing. In terms of, what potentially can be had in a negotiation, there's frankly, the sky's the limit as far as what can be achieved here. We had a recent situation where a doctor came to us with, frankly, it was one of the worst leases we've ever seen. It was completely landlord friendly, which is frankly, it's more often landlord friendly, although not to this particular extent. And the big piece was that it also left the doctor highly exposed to a lot of other risks associated with leasing. So, for example, leases are binding to all successors and heirs. If something were to happen to that particular doctor, unfortunately, landlords are in the business of collecting rent. They're not necessarily concerned about what happens to the doctor. So potentially that cost, that $2.9 million over the 30 years, might go to their next of kin or family. So what we did in terms of the negotiation was, in terms of the negotiation, what we were able to achieve in terms of wins financially and in terms of the legal language were, well, as far as this particular doctor was concerned, they were thinking about their eventual exit, but they were not, the transition was not on the immediate horizon. They were thinking about how to gear up for that. They were thinking about improving their own production. Certainly a renovation was on their mind. Within their particular lease, they had language that indicated that the landlord was privy to charging a supervision fee to watch over the the tenant as they perform the alterations, and that was $100,000 line in their lease. Also, if you're someone that's, let's say, mid-career and you're perhaps the transition is not particularly close, but within 10 or 15 years of the foreseeable future, making sure the lease is as transferable as possible is very important here. So what we did was we ensured that that particular doctor was released of liability after they sold to their associate or potentially to the DSO, whoever they decide to sell to. In addition to that, one of the big ones is that in terms of the lease, like I was saying, the lease has a huge impact on your potential proceeds of sale. Within that particular lease for this doctor, we found that there was language pertaining to what we call consideration, i.e., landlords having potential access to proceeds of your sale. So we put a quick end to that and we negotiated that particular section out. In addition to, the other items here, such as right of first offer for the adjacent space. When the doctor decides there's another space available and they're expanding, they're bursting at the seams, they have access to it now. We also negotiated tenant improvement allowance. I'll touch on some of the nuances of that in a little bit, but also in terms of that eventual transition, whether you're looking to do a new start somewhere else, a second location, or if you're expanding in your own space, while we're in there, we really should work on a couple of items here within this to make it as transferable as possible for your eventual exit. And that includes making your options to renew as transferable as possible so that your buyer has the option to stay in the space. Now, I'll go through a couple of the data points here in terms of some of the local real estate data. Now, of course, this data is very dependent on your particular area. I'm happy to pull that data offline for you. We can have a further conversation about that. But in terms of what we've been seeing, in terms of, well, I have a graph here for Toronto and Vancouver, but specifically downtown Vancouver. What we've been seeing as far as trends for that market is that, well, if you're looking to, frankly, if you're looking to relocate the practice to or within downtown Vancouver, I don't think it's any surprise, but it's a tougher market. What we've got in terms of vacancies right now is vacancies are sitting at 2%. So 2% of the retail square footage in Vancouver pertaining to retail space is currently vacant. That's 1% higher than it was the previous year. So that's a benefit to those that are looking. The key thing is that in terms of Vancouver downtown retail submarket, so retail spaces within downtown Vancouver, we've got 10.1 million square feet of real estate. But what's being built, what's being constructed that's new right now is 24,000 square feet. So in terms of downtown overall, it's a bit of a tougher market. And of course, for those that are outside of downtown, so for example, if you're in Poco or if you're in Delta, the situation, of course, will be different, right? Again, I'm happy to take a look at that for you offline. But in terms of this particular market, the key thing here is that if you're deciding to relocate your space, what data are you working with right now to decide, is this the right move for you right now? What we've seen here is that although real estate is certainly at a premium in downtown Vancouver, in terms of vacancies, in terms of general retail buildings, so our software classifies general retail buildings as, for example, shopping centers. 2.1% is the vacancy rate at the moment. However, vacancies in strip centers is 26.8%. So we've seen a more significant increase in vacancies in that particular segment of real estate in that market. Now, how this applies to you, it depends. Again, it depends on your market. But the key thing to have is you need the correct data to work with, to decide, is it the right time to potentially move out from, potentially from downtown Vancouver, or maybe it's the right time to stay in downtown Vancouver. If you're already in downtown Vancouver, perhaps it's the right time to potentially look toward expanding into your adjacent units and so on. If it depends on your particular situation. Walt, perhaps you can chime in on this. As a local, I'm in Toronto, of course. So your experience with where people are moving in the Vancouver, greater Vancouver area. What do you sense as far as where people are going, as the boots on the ground?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that is driven by availability, really. So everything's moving downtown core out, unless obviously you can find some space downtown where you can establish yourself. People that have been there a while tend to try to stay in that area, but a lot of the newer construction and builds that we see are in our suburb areas. You mentioned like a Poco, Surrey, Delta, those type of areas where it's a little bit more friendlier to be able to find a location and kind of keep it within a budget to be able to get yourself up and running if it's a move or if it's a new build. And it kind of follows the population too. I mean, it's sprawling. It's heading out in that way too. So as the population expands on outside that core of Vancouver, more amenities are needed, and so it creates more opportunity for businesses such as the dental business to be able to establish themselves.
Yeah, that's what I get as a sense as well. And frankly, I think the best approach to deciding where to move is the data, right? In terms of where to go, we need to follow the numbers, right? Where's the population growing? Where's the vacancies? And where's the opportunities? Talking about budget, we touched on this quickly here. So, in terms of that potential move or that potential expansion, we really want to touch on 7 key financials in terms of the lease. This is a huge, frankly, in terms of any kind of lease negotiation, we definitely want to touch on all 7 of these items if possible, especially if you're looking to expand or if you're looking to relocate. When formulating, well, first of all, your own budget, but second, how much of a loan you'll need from the bank. These will play an integral role. We definitely want to touch on your base rent. How does your rent compare? Or how does the prospective space that you're looking at, how does that rent compare to the rest of the area? When it comes to that rent piece, in terms of negotiation, if you're looking to do a build somewhere else, if you're looking for a new space, this is a huge opportunity to make your rent a bit more favorable. Because, frankly, if, like I said earlier, if your rent at $5,000 a month represents to the landlord $2.9 million, this is a huge opportunity for the landlord. So what we can leverage there is, look, we've got a great opportunity for you, Mr. Landlord, to have a fantastic dental tenant. There's a lot of meat on the bone that can potentially be picked in terms of the base rent, but also some of the other items that we'd want to touch on. Although, like I said before, your rent may be increasing at 3%. What's that look like in terms of everyone else? Is everyone else paying 3% as an annual increase? Is that fair for your given area? It might be light. It might be on the high end potentially. We'll have the data. We'll have the discussion to determine what's the right fit for that particular spot. Also, a very interesting one that I find is seldom negotiated is common area maintenance. This is a big discussion because, for those that are looking to buy a space, certainly it's always nice to be your own landlord and maybe you're not paying rent, but there's all these capital costs associated with owning the building, right? So for those that are leasing a space, you're also paying some of those capital costs. You're paying the maintenance and so on, but you're only paying your particular share. This is a huge piece of negotiation that can be had because although you are certainly, the landlord will want you to pay your particular share, to what extent do you need to pay for certain items that you may or may not be using in terms of that common area? Also, a big one for those that are looking to potentially renovate into or expand into their adjacent units, or for those that are looking to do a new build on a new lease space, is the fixturing period. We typically want to see as much fixturing period as possible because, well, certainly you'll need time. Sinclair will need time, and your dental specific contractor will need time to plumb the space and make it suitable for you to build. Walt, if you can chime in here, what do you typically see as far as the typical fixturing and turnaround time nowadays?
Let's just say by the time you get yourself situated and you get that first step or those steps out of the way, and you're actually at a point where you're ready to construct and or do that, we're typically looking 12 weeks as a time period. So you got a 3-month runway. That could easily be 4, and maybe slightly less, but typically on average, we're looking at about a 12-week period to kind of bring your dream to reality. So,
yeah, have you seen much in the way of delays? I noticed that during COVID, certainly there was a lot of delays regarding supplies, and heck, if you wanted to buy a car during COVID, I had friends that were waiting upwards of a year because of supply chain issues and so on.
Yeah.
Right? How's that? How did that look in during COVID? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, there always can be delays, and especially when you get into some of the minutia with things like permitting and such at different various levels of the build and all that. My recommendation, honestly, is go to professionals to kind of drive the project for you. Sometimes delays, we bring them on ourselves because it's exciting. Hey, I built a house once or something like that. I'm going to build my dental practice. But it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of things that can come from different angles that you need to be very decisive and be able to make quick decisions on to keep your project on track. And sometimes you think, well, I'm going to save a little bit of money by doing this, but at the end of the day, it can cost you a lot more, especially when you're talking timing delays. So, from an advice point of view, I really believe firmly that you want to surround yourselves with people that do this regularly, and that way you can relax and enjoy the fun stuff like picking out fixtures and or being involved in those type of steps, but let the heavy lifting be done by people that do it on a regular basis and can keep your project on track. So
Yeah, Walt. I certainly echoed that sentiment. What I found is that I mean I can't imagine what it would be like to run a dental clinic and then have to think about finding a location, negotiating the lease with the landlord, looking over all the various details in it, managing the build. This is a huge task, and I definitely echo your sentiment to have the right people on your team, guys. This is a big piece of it. Now, there's a lot that can be had in terms of the the lease negotiation and specifically to these financial variables. Again, in terms of the fixturing period, what we found is that certainly 3 months is average, certainly, but it certainly doesn't hurt to talk about getting a little bit of buffer here, right?
yeah,
For those potential delays. What does 4 months look like? What does 5 months of fixturing period look like? The big piece as well for those that are looking to do a relocation, if you're looking to get into a new space, is again, if you're signing a 10-year lease with that landlord and that lease represents $1 million, one more month to secure a tenant to stay for 10 years doesn't hurt the landlord. It's to their benefit to secure you as a tenant. So there's a lot of meat on the bone potentially. Of course, the conversation needs to be carefully choreographed. But again, we need to be able to try for as much as possible here to make this, well, one, reduce the cost of the potential build. We don't want you paying for any rent that you have to. So that's where the free rent piece does come in. Certainly in the fixturing period, we want to make sure that you'll be able to build your space rent free. But for signing that 10-year lease, again, that $1 million paycheck to the landlord certainly doesn't hurt to ask for 1, 2, 3, 4 months of free rent. Heck, we had one recently that we negotiated 6 months of free rent for that individual. So again, think about it from the landlord's shoes as well. Also, in terms of the build, as I touched on, the build can be, it will be expensive, certainly, depending on your area. How do you mitigate some of that? We can use tenant improvement allowance to mitigate some of the costs of the build. Now, there is a caveat here because typically people think of tenant improvement allowance as the landlord providing you money to build some of the space or reimburse you for the build. It's not always the case. We tend to, in Cirrus here, we tend to think of tenant improvement allowance as fool's gold because you got to remember the landlord is not necessarily in the business of providing money. They're not the bank. They're in the business of providing you space. So the question is, if they're not loaning money as a business, where's that money coming from? Typical thing is that that tenant improvement allowance gets baked back into your rent. So certainly having the discussion to determine, can we get tenant improvement allowance, or if we take more, how much does that affect the rent? We need to have that conversation as well. And finally, landlord work. Although you're building a space and you're spending the money to equip the space, plumb the space, would the landlord be willing to pitch in anything to help you with that? So one situation I think of is we had a doctor recently that was expanding into an adjacent unit, but they had some concerns because the building was a bit older, and like any older building, certain issues with maintenance come up, and one of them was air conditioner. So what we did was we negotiated the expansion in a 10-year term, and as part of the agreement, we managed to get the lender to replace that old air conditioning, which is typically at the tenant's expense. Usually in terms of AC maintenance, it depends on your lease. I'll have to take a look at it, for you individually after. But in terms of leases, anything within the premises and supporting the premises, including the air conditioning, is the responsibility of the tenant. So, having the landlord replace the $20,000 air conditioning unit as part of the lease deal is a definite win here. Also, I wanted to touch on this, in terms of buying versus leasing your real estate. For those that are looking for their first or even their second location, this has come up for me quite frequently now. A lot of doctors have indicated to me that they have a preference, not 100% commitment, but they've thought about purchasing real estate on their own, so they can be their own landlord and potentially earn rental income. When they decide to transition, they would prefer to hold on to the building. They've even discussed with me the chance to pass it on to their children. So it then becomes an issue or a piece of a property that can be passed down for generations potentially. And certainly it has its benefits. Of course, the issues are, well, well, perhaps you can touch on this a bit, but Canadian real estate, we found that it's certainly not as affordable as it used to be. That's for sure. But yeah, Walt, you and I were talking about this a little bit offline a couple of minutes ago. Yeah, if you may.
No, I mean, everybody knows the state of real estate, especially out on the West Coast here, Vancouver, and in Toronto and everywhere, really. It's all been affected. But I mean, that can take a lot of your I mean, it's great to buy if you can buy. Honestly, it's something worth looking at. But it can also take a lot of the juice away from you being able to, if you strap yourself too much right in the beginning just to get that building, and then it becomes more difficult to get the other things you need going. Maybe your plan can be different, where that's something I want to do, but maybe I need to get to a different level before I make that move, and you can kind of coordinate that through the type of space that you go for in the beginning. So, but it's definitely an expensive venture for sure.
Yeah, and I certainly echo that sentiment. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is what is it to lease, right? So, full disclosure, I'm a renter in Toronto, and what I can say about renting in Toronto at the moment is that it certainly has its perks. What we found is that if my rent was a mortgage, I'd be paying $1,000 more for my unit as compared to leasing it at the moment. So certainly there's a much smaller upfront cost when it comes to getting into a lease space. You don't have to pay for a significant loan to purchase the building and also build up space. That's one piece of it. But in addition to that, again, the key thing here is the capital costs. Just owning the building is not as simple as owning the building. You need to upkeep it. And depending on where you are, so for example, in downtown Toronto, I have a number of clients that are in 100-year-old plus buildings where there's some significant maintenance required for the buildings. And frankly, they're glad that they're only leasing the space because they're only paying their particular share, their proportionate share of that maintenance. So it does provide you a bit of cost savings. In addition to that, one of the big things that we always point out is if you look at the dental corps of the world and the 123s of the world, we look at their particular portfolios and how much real estate they own. Typically, the answer is zero. They don't usually own any real estate. And the reason is because for that $2 million that you utilize to buy that unit or buy that plot of land to build on, that's another $2 million that you're not using to purchase another clinic. So something else to consider here when you're deciding where you're going to go. Also, in terms of the lease, while we're talking and touching on the potential expansion opportunities and relocating, while we're looking at the lease and all the figures and the financial pieces, certainly in terms of the legal language of the lease, the business clauses, there's a number of significant ones that we want to work on to make this as secure an investment as possible. Again, with $2.9 million in line over 30 years, we want to make sure that whatever you're signing is indeed secure, that your investment in the space is secure, that, frankly, the big one in the major metropolitan areas, Toronto, Vancouver, and so on, is certainly the demolition clause. We want to be able to eliminate or mitigate that as much as possible. In addition to that, relocations, the ability of the land to move you from one unit to another. But in addition to that, in terms of your eventual exit, what's the assignment language look like as well? So one of the items that we wanted to touch on was if you were to relocate the clinic, what's your lease say about that, right? And this is a big one because it's, from the numerous conversations I have with doctors, what I found is that many of them think, what, I'm just going to move to this new space. The landlord has already said you're free to go at the end of your term, but it might not always be that simple. We find this particular section in the lease quite frequently. In fact, it's in most leases, and it's a restoration clause. So it's the landlord's ability to tell you that they want you to return the space to a pre-dental condition. Why would they do that? Well, there's a number of reasons. One of them is that perhaps the landlord might have a different plan for that particular space. So we had a situation last year where a doctor he had purchased a clinic. The lease was expiring. The effort there was to consolidate the charts and equipment and so on. It had no intention to stay. But the landlord had some different plans for the space. They indicated the tenant next door wanted the space, and they told our doctor to rip everything out, including the plumbing, including the lead line in the walls. So this is we don't, quite frankly, I don't see this particular section enacted very frequently. But the problem is, you never know when the landlord will want to take that space on for, and provide it to someone else and have you restore it. Additionally, one of the big pieces here when it comes to any kind of build is determining what belongs to who. This section is usually part of a larger section called alterations, and the alterations determine if you decide to build in the space, are you allowed to do so? What permissions are required, and the process of doing so. A big piece of that is, of course, trade fixtures. Walt, I think you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier when it comes to trade fixtures and dental specific cabinetry. I know that's become a bigger issue, like comparing building the space out with custom cabinets versus those that are dental specific that have serialized numbers. If you can touch on that.
Yes, a couple things on that. One is, I think when you do go to a really good product line of a cabinetry that's dental specific, you're getting the longevity of the product because it's usually built and made to stand up to the rigors of a dental practice. Think of sterilization centers and things like that. They're meant to stand up over time. But the other thing is being modular. They're pretty well individually serialized, so it doesn't become a fixture of your lease space. It actually becomes an asset of yours. And then if you ever were in a position where you're going to move or make a move, or even maybe you wanted to upgrade or do whatever, you own that and you can take it with you, or you can sell it and put something different in, or it just gives you a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, it's a good point. My perspective on this as someone that has experience with landlords, sometimes that area of who what belongs to who, it can become a bit of a gray area. If you look at section 3 of this particular section, when it indicates the tenant may remove their trade fixtures during the term, but does the landlord know that the cabinets you put in are dental specific and they can be removed? More often than not, they don't. They see cabinets in a space, they're thinking, okay, these cabinets are mine. So a huge effort here in terms of this particular language is defining, okay, what belongs to who, and are you allowed to take it with you when you go? It's funny. I don't know if I mentioned this, Walt, but we had a situation where we had a landlord whose son was a dentist, and the dentist that we were talking to was a tenant. They wanted to leave the space. The landlord said, well, all those items in the space, they're actually mine as per lease. And the idea was to have a fully built out dental space for their son. And it's wild. It sounds like it's out of a movie, but certainly the language in the lease is abundantly important in a scenario like that. We want to make sure that any holes in the boat are plugged for sure.
Yeah.
Moving on to some of the bigger ticket items here. If you're looking to potentially get into a new space, or interestingly, if you've got a neighbor that you're thinking their space could be great for my dental clinic, this is a key piece of language here when it comes to that. So the relocation clause provides the landlord with a huge amount of power. It allows them to move potentially the dry cleaner beside you to somewhere else and allow you to build into that space. But of course, the flip side is if the dry cleaner has this section in their lease, you probably have this section in your lease as well. So, one of the big things here is that, this is a tool that either can be used, for you or against you. Some of the language that we've seen here in terms of typical relocation clauses are shown here. What are the most detrimental pieces of this language for a dentist is section A. It says here that, well, the landlord at any time with 60 days notice may relocate the tenant. Now, well, perhaps you can chime in, but 60 days doesn't sound like a lot of time to me to move a dental clinic.
Oh, that's not a lot of time. You don't
Yeah,
wish that on anyone.
I didn't think so. And the kicker is that it says that the tenant will reopen for business to the public in the new premises by the date set out by the landlord's notice of relocation. So the moment the landlord tells you to leave, you have 60 days to relocate. Again, I don't think there's any chance that a dental clinic can get built in 60 days. That's for sure. If the landlord says you need to open in 60 days, we have a problem, right? So this is one of the big pieces here when it comes to negotiating the leases. Again, this might be a great tool if you have to use it against someone, but if it's in your own lease, not favorable. Additionally, if the premises are relocated, the lease will remain unchanged except the rent will be adjusted. So the bigger picture here is that if the landlord is relocating you, who's paying for it? And what are you paying? One of the key things I think about is, well, you're going to know more about this than I will, but from what I gather, the space, the overall layout of the location is very important, not just the square footage. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. So what we do is what's called a test fit. The idea is obviously in the beginning when you're looking to try to figure out, you got to kind of know what you want to do. Do I want 4 ops? Do I want 5 ops? That type of thing. When you are looking for a space, and I don't want to get off target here,
Mm-hmm.
but that gives you a bit of a blueprint to go out and figure things out. And we typically recommend that you have about 400 square feet per operatory. That's not the size of your operatory. That's just if I'm building a 4 operatory clinic, I typically need about 1,600 square feet in order to have a functional dental clinic. That's with your reception area. That's with your all the other areas that you need in a dental clinic to make things run smoothly and properly, good access, all that type of thing. So we do a test fit for our clients, so when they are out looking and trying to find us a place, they can bring us that blueprint and we can tell them, well, you're going to be able to get your 4 ops, or maybe you get 5, or maybe you might want to look at scaling up or down accordingly. So very helpful to know that before you just kind of jump in.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. So what I gather is that it's not just the square footage that matters. The layout is abundantly important,
Yes.
and yeah, that's what we want to avoid here in terms of this particular language. It's, of course, the square footage is, as Walden indicated, it's going to be very important to determine prior to looking for space. What do you want out of your clinic? If you want 4 or 5 or 6 ops, the appropriate square footage needs to be looked at. If you're a 5 op clinic, 2,000 square feet, seems appropriate. That's fine. But in this particular scenario, if you had to leave your 2,000 square foot space and get into another 2,000 square foot space, but it's an L shape compared to a square
Right.
or a rectangle, you might have a problem. The layout might not be suitable for 5 ops anymore. It might only fit 4. So if you ever were to relocate into a space that was not favorable and you lose an op, that obviously has a huge detriment to the the production potential of that space.
Yeah.
So we want to be able to mitigate that as much as possible. Additionally, the bottom piece of this language is really the kicker, because ultimately this is the landlord space and they're exerting their control over the space with this particular section. It's indicating that, well, if you object to the relocation or the location, if that new space is not suitable because of the shape and so on, the landlord might not necessarily care. If they've got a huge tenant that wants your space, they might elect to just simply terminate your lease. And that particular section is quite common to see within a relocation clause. And first of all, in terms of any negotiation, in terms of the overall costs associated with that, as we had discussed, like perhaps you want to touch on this, Walt, but what I've found is, especially in the larger metropolitan areas, depends on your area, of course. If you're in Saskatoon or Winnipeg, the build up may be different, but in the larger areas, it can be quite expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at just even the lower mainland area, a typical average probably starts well over $400 a square foot. And then depending on what area you're going into can be more. It's a new building. If it's like a new complex, it might have additional costs to that. If you're in an area like the greater downtown area, we have retail space in Greater Vancouver that goes upwards of $1,500 a square foot to build out. Now that's not saying that it's necessarily conducive for a dental practice, but that just gives you an idea how steep those prices can go. And I'm sure there's something even higher than just what I've heard on that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
my goodness. So of course, considering builds, in the greater Vancouver area can be upwards of that. If the clinic were to be relocated, according to landlord's new plans, this could be potentially, if you have a 2,000 square foot space, this could be a mistake of upwards of $800,000. Furthermore, if you're looking to leave your space and you're going into a different unit, if you're relocating, restorations of your current space, they're certainly, I wouldn't say they're cheap, to be clear. Now, what I found is that the demolition costs for space are roughly $20 to $25 a square foot. I'm working on data regarding that. I'm working on data from a few years ago. It may have gone up now, right? But of course, depending on your space, this is upwards of $50,000. The big piece of this is if you ever need to relocate, we want to make sure that you have sufficient lease term to continue practicing while your new space gets built. Because if your new space is not ready and you are somehow forced to exit your current space, your practice could be in limbo while your new space is being built. What's that do to patient attrition and loss of production? Something like this can ultimately cost the tenant $850,000 plus. I recently had a doctor that it's pretty wild. There was construction going on in the common area being conducted by the landlord and in the adjacent unit. There was dust everywhere, and jackhammers were disrupting the operations of the clinic. Uh, and the amount of production lost per day that the accountant for the doctor had worked out, they determined it was upwards of $8,000 a day for that particular clinic. So we definitely want to make sure that your particular clinic, if you have a space right now, is if you're looking to build out a new space, it's that we want to make sure there's continuity in the lease so that you can operate while your new space is being built. Now, in terms of what can potentially be achieved here in any kind of relocation, we have a great case study on Dr. Kahan here from Vancouver. What we managed to negotiate for him was, well, he was looking to relocate to a different space. Frankly, the the financial wins speak for themselves alone. The fixturing period alone was $20,000. What we negotiate as a total in terms of reduced rent, fixturing period, free rent, and so on was a total of $870,000. In terms of when to get started, in terms of that strategy, when you want to get started here is, well, we think of this as a cycle. If you sign a 10-year lease, I wouldn't suggest approaching the landlord at year two to renegotiate all your terms. The landlord simply doesn't have any incentive to do so. They've got you locked in for another 8 years. But what we found through our 30 years is that there is a sweet spot as far as when to get involved. And we've determined that's 1 to 2 years before the expiry of the lease. Here's a couple of key things. In terms of what the landlord is thinking, if you're approaching the landlord 2 years before the expiry, indicating that you want to renegotiate terms, you may be looking for more room, you may be looking to do a renovation, you're about to make a substantial investment to the landlord's space. This is music to the landlord's ears. Furthermore, there's always a potential to relocate if need be. In terms of our experience with relocations, what we found is relocations certainly don't happen right away. We find that vetting the spaces that are available, having Sinclair or your dental specific contractor go out to the space to vet the space to determine the viability of the space as a dental clinic. In addition to negotiating the lease with the landlord, it certainly takes time. It can take upwards of a year. So the key thing is you need to provide yourself with enough time in order to do so. Now, of course, if your plan is not to relocate, it's to simply renegotiate your lease, maybe expanding your current space, that still applies because from the landlord's perspective, you're negotiating the lease, but there's a potential you could leave if you don't get what you want. So 24 months before the expiry, 2 years before expiry is definitely the sweet spot. Here's the flip side of this. If you're approaching the landlord, let's say 4 months before the expiry date, as we discussed, it's very difficult to potentially find a new space and negotiate the lease and build it out within 4 months. The landlord also knows this. So having that time to negotiate the lease is the biggest strategy when it comes to this entire process. Now, in terms of what you need to have in line before beginning, what we certainly want to do is gather all your documents. It's it's still shocking after years of working here. It's still shocking to find out how many doctors don't know where their leases are. I completely understand. You're going to be busy running the clinic. Some of you may even have multiple clinics. The lease typically gets buried in the bottom of the drawer. Right? It becomes simply a number that you pay every month. But you absolutely need to know where it is and what it has potentially if you're looking to either renegotiate your terms or move. We definitely want to have a discussion about your particular goals for the clinic. What's the objective? If you can wave a magic wand, what would you want to happen? We also want to review those said documents. We want to outline what are the risks associated with your current agreement. If you're looking at a new space, what are the risks you're signing up for potentially if you're looking at this new space? We want to prepare all the data. The key thing is we're going to use data to determine is this space a good fit for you financially, but in terms of also the business terms. And in terms of the approach with the landlord, notice we haven't talked to the landlord whatsoever yet. What we're doing is we're formulating a strategy with you and determining what's the ideal scenario, what's the potential outcome here for this negotiation. Only up until that point, when we gather the data, we formulate the plan, do we begin discussion with the landlord in terms of the economic terms, but in terms of the business terms as well. And of course, once we get back that final lease agreement, we certainly want to look over it to ensure that everything is absolutely consistent between what we discussed with them initially. So I thank you everyone for your time for this evening to go through this with us. I highly encourage everybody here, if you haven't done it before, what's on offer today is a critical dates and risk analysis. I'll be happy to look over your current lease agreement, even if you think it's not going to be expiring for any time soon. Let's say if it's 5 years away, that's fine. You need to have the correct data to decide where to steer your ship. So I'd be happy to look over the data in terms of your lease, in terms of any potential red flags that might be present, in addition to pulling any available real estate data to give you a rent comparison as well. Now, of course, we've run a couple of minutes over time, but I'd like to ask the audience, if there's any questions that anyone has thought of, or anything that's popped up, please don't hesitate to reach out now. Walt, any final thoughts about? Actually, we've got someone that's raising their hand here. Please, if you don't mind, just type in the question here into the chat, and then we'll be happy to help answer it as best we can. But yeah, Walt, any final thoughts in terms of what we talked about?
No, I would just say that like you say, I think it's super important to know your lease in advance so you can navigate your moves. Um, Landlords they're not going to come running to you to tell you, hey, your lease is coming up. They're going to wait until that very last minute if you're not seeing anything, because that puts all the pressure on you and all the power with them. So just remember that. I think that's an important thing. And yeah, like a feasibility study. Like if you're looking for an area that you want to go to, test fits one thing, but feasibility is another. Like, does it have the amenities that you need to, is access to the building good? Is there good parking? Does it make sense for what you're trying to create in terms of the type of practice you are? So we're here to help. We have a full-blown design service team in Vancouver, and we create dreams. And we manage the process and make it easy. And you're very involved, but we manage the process through the whole process from start to finish. So you can do what you do best, which is continue to grow your practice.
Perfect. Yeah. So in terms of the questions that are asked, we've got two, kind of the same thing. So the question is, what is right of first offer? So the second one is right of offer versus first refusal. Well, these are two sides of the same coin. Right of first offer can be for example, if there is a space that is available, then the landlord may offer you that space first. But what happens as well is if there's a right of first refusal, what I see that frequently is within the context of building purchase. So if you're leasing a building, let's say it's a standalone building, and the landlord decides to sell the building, you then have the right of first refusal to purchase the building. They may make it available to you. You can turn them down first. So I hope that answers the questions here. Now, as far as right of first offer, this can be structured in a number of ways. It can be the first offer to take over the adjacent space. I've seen it written as take over any space on the floor or any floor below if it's available. So in terms of the way that's structured, it can be structured in a number of ways. But the usual is that we see that as a right to take on some sort of space that is available. In any case, everyone, I thank you for your time on the on the Pacific. It's 6:30 now. I'm sure everyone's gearing up to have dinner and so on. I'll leave you to it. And again, I encourage everyone to reach out. Happy to have a chat with you. And whether you're looking to relocate your space, heck, even those that are looking to build their first space or second space, or maybe expand where they're at right now, potentially now's the time. Let's make 2025 the best year ever. I look forward to chatting with you all soon. Walt, thanks again for joining us for this webinar. And yeah, have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Thank you. Good night.